Amen. We're trying to understand the relationship between progression, typology, and fractals. Hopefully we can see the difference or the distinction between progression, where we have a line of history, and in that history you get different events occurring, 1, 2, 3, 4 events, and each of these events lead you from one step to the next. There's separate, unique, distinct steps that take you from the beginning to the end. Within that history, there may be other unique histories, but at this scale you cannot see that. All you do is go from one step to the next. Then what we can notice is that history, there may have been 2 separate histories, which we might call the Millerites and the 144,000. And what we see is that there are characteristics at number 1 and number 4 which seem to match the characteristics of number 1 and number 4 in this history. And we see in the Millerite history, 1, 2, 3, 4 are a line of progression or events that bring you to number 4, and it's the same in the 144,000. What we can do is we can break this line of progression, and we can see that this history was an identical replica of this history. So therefore we can bring this one underneath and call this the 144 line, and we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's what I understand when we use this concept of typology, that this was a type of this. So we were speaking in between the breaks, some of us, and we began to ask ourselves, is typology even the right word to be using? Or should perhaps we be using another word that may or may not be better? So I'm not sure whether or not typology is the best word to use, or whether it's not. But there are other words that we do use besides typology. One word we use is examples. And I was mentioning that the Bible uses another word, which is ensample. I think they're different words. They're very closely related, and at one level they're the same, an ensample or an example. But my understanding of ensample, maybe we should look at that word. Where's it found? Now all these things happen unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come. Someone say something?
6 and 8.
6?
Verse 6 and verse 11.
Oh, verse 6 and verse 11, sorry. So in verse 6 it says examples, and verse 11 it says ensample. Sorry? It's the same Hebrew word.
Greek word.
Greek, yeah. So Strong says from 5180, which means a die, that is by implication a stamp or scar, by analogy a shape, that is a statue, a style or resemblance, specifically a sampler, type, a model for imitation or instance. So it talks about this die. So an example, I'm not sure it really portrays the idea of a die. I don't know if everybody knows what a die is. Yeah? What is a die?
Something for designing.
Sorry?
Something for designing.
Something for designing? D-I-E.
The one using tossing.
Sorry?
The 6 first cube.
I can't hear you.
The 6 first cube or what? The small like 6 first cube. This for playing.
The singular dice.
Oh no, not this. That's not what a die is. It's not a cube where you throw and it's got numbers.
Isn't a die like, for example, if you had a white top and you want to puzzle it, would you use a die?
No.
From my understanding of a die, the one that I'm assuming is used here, for example, you wanted to use, let's say, certain cartons. So you first have to make a template that you can use now to press whatever you'll be cutting out the templates from.
Yes.
So this die, depending on the particular pattern it has, will produce exactly the same impression or cartons from the material that you have. So that's how I understand that.
Anyone else?
Just like you said, I think it is something used in engineering manufacturing.
Yes.
Like a template you form using to produce products.
So it's an engineering tool, often to cut out a shape or to stamp a pattern on. And when you put it into this machine, which is a press, it stamps that pattern onto whatever the material is. It's normally sheet steel or something. It can cut it out or it can produce a pattern. That's what a die is. And it replicates it so it's always identical. And I think that is slightly different to an example, because an example doesn't have to be an identical replica. It could just be very similar to something, if that makes sense. I think there's a difference there. It's a die as when you strike something, a stamp or a scar, by analogy a shape. If you go to Thayer's, it says the mark of a stroke or a blow print, figure formed by a blow or impression. It uses the word number 4, an example. In the technical sense, the pattern in conformity to which a thing must be made. So the problem with these dictionary definitions, these are dictionaries, obviously lexicons, is that sometimes, depending on which one you want to go for, they sort of merge into one. But I want to suggest that the actual definition, one that we want to go with, and I think is the right one, it comes from the word 5180. Primary verb means to thump or to hit or to pummel or to strike. But in any case, it's not a singular strike. in any case by repeated blows, thus differing from other words, 31:17, 39:16, which mean to strike. So my understanding is when it uses this word ensample, it doesn't just mean a singular stroke, it means repeated strokes. So you get these repeating patterns, if you like, which is what the definition of a die is, and it distinguishes that from a singular blow. So it says these things were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come, and those things are identical repeating patterns. That's how I've explained it. That's how I understand the difference between an example and an ensample. So I don't know if we're able to use that concept by still using the word typology or example, by seeing it's an exact replica. Now I know people could say that the sanctuary system is an identical replica of the plan of salvation, and I guess at some level it is, but it really isn't an identical replica of it. But I don't want to stress the point, except if we can see it that way. So we spoke about the line of progression. In a line of progression, what we can see are histories. It may not just be two, it may be three histories, and in those histories we can see 1 to 4 occurring, and therefore we'd break this line and we'd get 3 histories. So if this was progression, these would be types. The difficulty now comes is because if we say this one and this one and this one, they're types or ensamples of one another. So this is ensample 1, ensample 2, and this is the end of the world. These ensamples were for us, upon whom the ends of the world have come. If we can see that, we've gone from progression to what we've called typology, and we can put equals here. So progression, typology, progression ensamples, if you're okay with that. The problem that we have is where Brother Roberts was trying to introduce his thoughts, he's not here now, is that if this is a wheel and we say this is a wheel, we're saying what about these wheels? They're identical wheels. Progression and typology, progression and ensamples. The difficulty now becomes that these histories, where were they created from in the first place? This 1, 2, 3, 4 were all created from this history here. If we can see it, it was these 3 dispensations. E1, E2, and this is the end of the world. So this one has all the same characteristics of this one, which is what we call fractals. Here's the culprit, it's coming in now. So we've got progression. We never even considered fractals. We just said in this history, this singular history, there were 3 separate histories. We went into those 3 separate histories, and even though I bookended them, there were spaces in between them. So I've shown the spaces in between them here. And I've got 3 histories. Ensample 1 and ensample 2 are all pointing us to the end of the world. So I've said that they're equal. I've changed the word from type to ensample, if we're okay with that. at one level, they're very similar words. They're just synonyms. But when we did that, and we said 1, 2, 3, 4 is 1, 2, 3, 4 is 1, 2, 3, 4, where did these all come from? This 1, 2, 3, 4 was a part of this history, and the characteristics here, 1, 2, 3, 4, are the same characteristics as we have here. So we've gone from progression to typology, and in that we've suddenly just used the concept of fractals, because this ensample, which was an ensample which was a type of this history, so type 1, type 2 is this is pointing this to here, in and of themselves they all are fractals of this larger line. So we've kind of come full circle. Is what's the difference between progression, typology and fractals? And there are some distinct and unique properties about them, but they also seem to have similar characteristics. So then if someone wants to make a comment, Brother William?
Yeah, I think that is correct. As I said earlier, in theory you can note the differences, but now when we come to the lines, it becomes difficult to differentiate. But I recognize the fact that there are differences, but when it comes to line, the same concept used in fractals is the same concept in typology. So in lines they seem like they are the same, but in theoretically you can see the differences.
Brother Robert? You summarize your understanding.
My understanding so far is I'm kind of leaning towards the fact that typology is the wrong one for whatever we are doing. But if you take those two lines that you have up there, Millerite 144, the same concept that you are applying there, if you come and apply it in one line, that concept is called fractals. So it's the same concept that is applied in the Millerite 144 kind of comparison, but when it is applied in one line and you begin now subdividing it into smaller portions, that is what we call fractal. So typology, so fractal, let me just use typology, but so a fractal is one form of typology when it is done on one line and then begin.
The reason why this issue came up, that it became an issue, was because people were suggesting that 9/11, I'll put midnight here because that's the symbol that they were using, and we're using the word raphia, so we have an anchor point. They were saying that 9/11 was a type that pointed to raphia. And if you're going to use that concept of type, typology means they're at one level equal to each other. So 9/11 would equal raphia, but this would be then the imperfect, and this would be the perfect fulfillment. And when people start going down that route, that is not an accurate representation of what's going on in this history. This destroys the concept of harbinger, of a token, or a sign, if we can understand it that way. Because typology means they're the same thing, but this is not the real one. I don't want to call it fake, but it's not real, but this is the real one. This is the genuine thing, and this is not the genuine thing. That's what typology is portraying, which is why Brother Robert wants to shy away from this, the word even typology, because then we have to go back, say, to the line of Christ and say, well, those real things that were going on, or were they not real? Because if we start saying that they're types, we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? So it becomes a problematic issue that we start having to use a language that we don't all fully understand or use in the same way to try and explain rules and principles that are hard enough themselves. You're frowning, Sister Emma. What's the problem?
You see, they are types, and not so much.
What you say they? What is the they?
I don't understand you ask it with Christ-like, because when you're saying, are they real things? Even the types are real things, but they're still types. That's the whole point of doing mindful alignment. So we see characteristics in these things, which is saying exams, that's a type. That's an example. And so when you start talking about real and not real, I'm thinking, I don't really understand. And when you're doing that up there, I'm thinking, okay, it's almost like using the language of the midnight cry, true midnight cry. Okay, so what's the difference between what you just said and...
Is 9/11 the type of raffia?
No, I don't think so. But I think the logic of the fact that we have several fathers, we don't move on that way. No, I don't think it is. But when you were talking about Christ-like, I'm thinking, when you start talking about real and not real, I'm thinking, but if it was all real, then the whole point of us doing all these things is to get those characteristics out and see that we're repeating the same thing. It's a symbol for us, it's not the same exact event, it's the same characteristic that's real for them. So I'm struggling, and when you say that progression is about all of thought, it's progressive mind, you can't.
Well, let's go one bit at a time. So this whole issue arises because I'm saying this is not a type of this. You assert to that you can't say 9/11 is a type. This is a series of progressive events that bring you down to this point. They're not types. 9/11 is not raffia. Then you said that typology is okay to use.
Yes.
The AD 34 is a type of a Sunday law.
Okay, so I'm just picking up on what she's saying. When you come to the types, anti-type, for example, you go to the sanctuary, we have a priest who is slaying a lamb, and that is something that is happening in real time. But that lamb which is slain is pointing forward to something else. So it is true that the type is normally real in that sense, but someone may also argue the fact that it is not real, and what he may be meaning by the fact that it is not real is the fact that it is pointing to something else. So I get what she's saying, but I think it depends with what you mean by real or not real.
Okay, give us an example that you're suggesting is not typology, but has the same feel to it. So I used AD 34 with Sunday law. Is that type? Is AD 34 pointing to the Sunday law in the same way that the sacrifice of a lamb is pointing to the death of Christ?
I don't think so.
Sister Emma saying it is so, and you're saying it is not so.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So I think she'd agree with you that the lamb is not real. It has no inherent value to it, even though it got killed in real life. But it's pointing you to something else that is real. So why is 34 not the same characteristics?
Because 34 has something inherently within it that is significant. It's a bit different from what you're saying about the lamb. The lamb has nothing inherently within it that is significant, just pointing to something else. But 34 AD was in itself a fulfillment of prophecy. It was something real that was happening. So that's why I'm saying when we do this line upon line, I don't think that for me typology type is the right word to you.
I would say the other way, I'd say the lamb is more real than 1835. Because they have to bring a real lamb for their sins, they have to really do that. The lamb has to die. It's exactly the same characteristics as Christ, but then it's compulsory for them to do that. It's real for them as the death of Christ in that sense.
Yeah, I agree with you about the lamb, but when it comes to the 34 AD and the Sunday law, for me, in my mind at least, it's different. I don't think typology is the right.
You've got to get out of your mind and put it into her mind. That's anyone else? Did I see a distinction? No?
I think it's the same dilemma we get in when we talk about Raphia and Cranium, and we call it a harvest. Half is a close of progression, and in a close of progression, Michael stands up. But again, in the same line, just at the close of progression is where Daniel 12:1 is. So, how do you explain that?
You want me to explain that?
No, I'm not explaining.
Yep.
So, in trying to respond to what Sister Emma is doing, I'm thinking about the repetition of history. History 1 happens and then it's going to repeat, and then it's going to repeat in history 2. So, when you are approaching the repetition of history, is history 1 a type of history 2? I don't think so. And when we come into this issue of 34 AD and the Sunday law, what I see is that what happened in 34 AD will repeat itself at the Sunday law for another class of people, but at that level, I don't see it as a typology.
Sorry?
If it's not a typology, what are we doing with it then? Why are we doing anything with it?
History is repeated.
Wherever you want it to, but it's not a type. Into my mind. Because it depends on
No, history repeating, we're looking for the way that history repeats and we can line it up.
because it's a type for us. If it's not a type, it doesn't have any inherent meaning in it, then there's no point in lining it up. You know, what's the point of putting any grade next to ours if it hasn't got similar characteristics and becomes a type for us? So it seems that they're all types. That's what we said about those people there, because they're their types. And then I think within that line, when we make a fractal, there's two groups in there which enables us to make that a type in a way. I don't know if you want to call it a type, but a fractal, I don't know if Robert's still saying it's different from a type, it's the same as a type. But it seems to me like we can now, you know, in the middle I introduce two groups and we run them up underneath each other and see 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, so we split the line again. So to me that's all types. And when you say you can't do types in a progressive line, I'm thinking that's kind of being undone a bit because we just split the line when we see license to do that and then do types.
When you split a line, it's not a line.
You say when we have progression we can't do it.
And you disagree with that.
No, because when you have progression you have one line anyway.
So you don't disagree. You sound like you're disagreeing, but when I pin you down, you don't disagree. So you tell me the disagreement.
Disagreement is in a progressive line, you've only got one.
There's not a progressive line, it's just a line.
A line of progression is.
Can you have typology there?
Where you stop that line, so progressive line. So the first one.
If we have a line, can you have typology in that line?
No, the only way you can have progression is to line it up underneath each other. You can't line up one line underneath each other. So you can't have progression in the line unless you split it now and line it up underneath each other. And then
Well, then you have how many lines?
2, 3, 4. And then you can do it.
So what are you disagreeing with?
I disagree with the fact you say. The way it's worded is you can't do it, but then we do it.
We don't do it. We get a pair of scissors and we cut a line. So I'm not saying you're not allowed to cut lines. I'm saying if you don't cut the line, you're not allowed to have typology. That's all I'm saying. If you don't cut the line, if you cut it, you can do what you want.
You have to have two things to compare.
No? After I thought you disagree.
I
think I've given verses for them.
On what issue? Because I don't.
On the issue of typology,
Oh, that one. Okay, yeah. The typology, when the lamb points to Christ, is the same as the AD 34 points to.
Yeah, points to the Son because the definition in our definition of progression and typology, we look at a progressive history, or we look at the line of progression, and we see multiple histories, and in that progressive line, in that progressive history, we can, if we are going to take that single line of progression, we can have typology. But when we cut the lines or the history, then we use the reform lines that are within that progressive history, then we are going to have typology, and each reform line is going to have a similar characteristics previously. For example, if we take the history of progressive history of the particular how many lines we have there?
What I'm worried about your answer is that you keep on using the word progression, and she's not used that word. She's okay to put the issue of progression aside, and the question is whether typology is the same as repeat of history. So if you confine your response to typology and repeat of history, are they exactly the same thing? Not the issue of progression.
To me, it's the same.
Typology. It's not exactly the bit of history, but it is the event that happens where it's just how can I say, like a picture or a mirror what will happen in the end of days. Like in the Old Testament, we had the lamb typifying the antitype, which is Christ. When we see the lamb and Christ, these are two different things. But one is a symbol of the other.
Did you hear any of that?
You're saying one's a symbol of the other, I'm saying, is that
So, to me, when I do the typology and repeat of history, they're two different things. For example, my simple question is, when you look at the lamb that was slain in the sanctuary, each and every day, when you come to Christ now, the real lamb slain, which history do you see repeating? Or just this lamb was pointing forward to Jesus? But when you have repeat of history, you have real life things that happen, and they're being repeated in like a second history.
She doesn't understand what you just said.
I'm saying when you look at the lamb, like if you're saying typology equal to repeat of history. For example, take the lamb that was slain each and every day in the sanctuary. How do you see history connected with that lamb being repeated in the history of Christ?
She's laughing at you.
So sorry. I'm trying to make the difference between repeat of history, because we're saying not everything repeats in our history, but whatever we pick out that repeats, we're saying is a type. So is that why you're making this picture? So, okay, so if you say all history, then it's different from repeat history. The way we use the term repeat of history is we pick out things that we see that repeat, or that are waymarks that are going to repeat, and we use those as types. Because we don't take everything from all those lines and say all repeats, so we don't call that repeat of history.
So, what I think when you go to the lamb in the sanctuary, the lamb was pointing forward to Jesus. So we have one thing pointing to Jesus. But when it comes to the history of AD 34, it's really history that happened, and we're using to line it up with our history and see how that history gets repeated in our history. We don't say like AD 34 is pointing forward to the Sunday law, but we take that history and line it up with the Sunday law and see this real life history that happened and line it up with the history that happens at the Sunday.
And then it becomes a type. Is that? So, the story of the lamb, can it stand on its own 2 feet and end the story? Could it ever have the ability or power to do that? It would. The plan of salvation, could it ever in and of itself be the plan of salvation? No? So if you go to Hebrews 9:9, go to 9:7. But into the second went the priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Ghost thus signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while the first tabernacle was yet standing. So, whilst the first tabernacle was yet standing, the thing could not have been manifested, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. So you know, whatever would have happened in that history, it could never have ended the story of the great controversy of salvation. Something else has to happen afterwards. So I think people are using the concept of typology in that strict sense here, that example can never complete the story. There has to be something else afterwards that this was pointing to. In a strictest sense, typology or an example. So the question is, when we go to reform line histories, do they have all of those identical characteristics? And the answer is yes or no. Sister Emma? Does every single history that we've had in the past, in and of itself, never have the ability to have finished the great controversy? That it, by definition, would have had to only have stood in that history, pointing to the final culmination, which is where we are today, just as this one was. Do none of them have the ability to finish the story? None of them have that ability.
I don't think so.
Okay, so if you go to the line of the Millerites, we've already created an argument based upon the spirit of prophecy that the Millerite line has everything inherent in it, has all the ability to finish the great controversy. And therefore, if it did, therefore it's not it doesn't have the same properties or characteristics as the lamb that never had that ability, because it could never purge you of your conscience. And it says which stood only in meats and drinks and diverse washings, imposed upon them until the final time, which is Christ, if you want to use it that way. It never has that ability, but the Millerite line has that ability. It has distinct and separate characteristics outside of that classic understanding of typology, because the lamb, which was the type of Christ, never had inherent properties to it that could finish the controversy, but the Millerite history does. It has inherent properties that can finish that story.
I think you could argue at every step you have to introduce a plan B because they didn't follow through with plan A. And you can take that right back to the time of Eden.
That's fine. Was the lamb plan A or B? You got the lamb and Christ. Which is plan A and which is plan B? It doesn't work in that way. It's not a plan A and plan B. Christ imposes upon them, until the times of restitution, this model, which was not a plan A or plan B based upon failure. It was his designed plan. But you can't use that same argument that it was God's designed plan that the Millerites would flunk the test, therefore we would be created. It doesn't work with that dynamic.
Is the Millerite the only line that does that then?
Even if it is the only one that does it, it doesn't follow exactly the same pattern. Even if it's the only one that we had, it's not going to be your defense.
But I would say that all the lines, apart from the line example we're using, all the lines could have finished the work if they'd been faithful. If they'd been honest, the Messiah would come a lot earlier, the whole plan would have been destroyed. Every generation from the Messiah was coming in their generation.
If you use that argument,
And it was disobedience.
if you use that argument about disobedience, it's not the same argument as the Lamb and Christ, which was the argument that you used about typology.
No, that's the only one you can say that with. It's only them. No, I'm saying that is typology.
What is?
It's not typology.
I'm not saying it was. I'm saying you use that as leverage or your argument to say that history repeating is also typology, because the history of the Millerites points to our history, and it's not the same dynamic. It doesn't have the same inherent properties, because the Millerite history is genuine history that stands on its own feet, that can complete the work of salvation, and the Lamb could never have done. And the argument that you put forward is the reason why the Millerites don't become that is because they're failure. But that doesn't work with the same model of the Lamb and Christ. The Lamb model doesn't complete the plan of salvation because lambs are unfaithful, or people don't kill lambs properly, or they don't construct the temple properly.
No, I see that.
So it's inherently different to repeating histories.
And I think I agree that the Lamb is the only scenario, because all the histories repeat the same thing. So I don't know how that actually affects the model.
Because you use the model of Lamb and Christ as your argument to say that is clear typology, and Millerites and us are clear typology, but they don't have the same inherent properties.
But yeah.
I'm sure you. But you use it as your defence.
I picked up that the Lamb is more of a type than what you were saying about being before. That was where the Lamb came from. I think we used to like this one. I don't know if that makes any difference to the entire argument about types. I can see what you're saying there is that could never fulfill.
Could the history of Christ ever have fulfilled the plan of salvation? Could it all have finished in AD 70?
Yeah.
Yes? And you're saying no? Sorry?
Because it hasn't gone, you mean, I'm saying it could have gone from a photo.
I'm just putting this down because I think the issue is with the Lamb and Christ. The Lamb could exist with Christ, so it was pointing to Christ, but with all the other history, in and of itself, it could have fulfilled the whole plan. So I think that's a different type of typology. So the issue is, for example, with 9/11 being the time of midnight, they use the symbol, what's it called? The Lamb and Christ, but that's a different typology to say that 1834 is the Sunday Lord.
Okay, that's not even a different typology, that's actually wrong.
Now, I guess what it's coming from the understanding of like the Lamb and Christ. That's how it's used. Because
Yeah, but the methodology in and of itself is wrong.
so I'm just trying to make a distinction between the two. Of what are we calling types?
I understand the distinction you're making, but I don't think you can use this as an example of that. because 9/11 was never equivalent to Raphia. A lamb was equivalent to Christ, but 9/11 was never equivalent to Raphia.
Are you understanding my thought?
Yeah, but you said that's the lamb and that's Christ.
No, I'm saying that's probably how people were viewing it to get to that conclusion.
Which we know is wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm saying, but now I'm saying, in reference to the types of recording, like 80% before the Sunday rule, how would we explain that as a type? Because it's that very different to the Lamb of Christ.
I think there seems to be at least some acknowledgement of some parts that the way we're using type is loose. Maybe we need a stricter definition. Maybe we don't. Maybe it's okay to use this relaxed language as long as you all understand what it means. Sister Emma's saying it's okay to use typology, it's a good word, it all works fine. Brother Robert saying, no, we need to have a new word because typology isn't the right word to use.
Yeah, because I think I'm saying it's probably not the right word to use, because using that example, 8034 is not pointing to the Sunday law, but we're taking characteristics, and that's how we can address it to be the Sunday law. But a type has to point to something. It has to be like a foreshadow or something else. I think just the thing in my mind is that, because it's leading to the thing that you said about false and true, but I'm thinking like 8034 was true and Sunday was true. So if you have two things will put it apart.
Sister Emma says yes. Brother Robert says no. Brother William?
I think
I want us to get to a place at the end of this in a few minutes, because I want to move on, that we all are able to explain something, even if it's in your own unique way, that we're not arguing against one another and we're all basically on the same page.
Yeah, I think I also agree that typology is not really the right word to use.
Use for what?
Because
used to explain this whole issue. That's what he means.
Because as Ruth is saying, if you take an example of 34 AD, we loosely use that in the movement that for 34 AD is a type of the Sunday law, but if you get to the real definition of typology, you can see that 34 AD is not foreshadowing, but it's telling you the characteristics of 34 AD, just bring them down to the standard. So we will have to look for a more convenient word to use.
Anybody want to make a comment?
I think type is not the right one, but if you're going to use it, then all of us need to understand how we are using it. Because changing the whole, we may not get another word for what we have, but if we're using typology, we need to understand what we mean by typology, because it's not, the strict definition of typology is not what we are doing.
Brother Kefis?
I think I'm beginning to see what Robert is saying. If you are going to use, I see some sense that if you are going to use the one typology, it's going to use something. Because we are saying that there is no typology in the line of progression. But the history of the occurrence, which the Bible says is a type. The occurrence of a type of Christ, that's the line of progression. So you can't have a type. You can't have a typology in the line of progression.
Sister Emma?
I'm not sure I understand your point.
Say that again?
I'm not understanding his point about not having maybe an argument because the offerings are telling Christ you can't have that.
Yeah, we are saying, which is, we have illustrated that in the line of salvation, we can't have a authority in the line of salvation. So, I'm saying that we need to find a better word to express technology, because when you look at the history, I'm going to see the sense, but when you look at the history of that history of the offering, it's a progressive history. When we don't consider the sacrificial systems that are talking to Christ, it's a line of progression. But we are saying that we can have typology in a line of progression. But we know that the offerings that were being offered were typified in Christ. So that we need to find how we need to harmonize with that, because there's some loosely. They are saying in the line of progression, there is no typology. But in the line of the offerings are pointing to Christ, it's a line of progression.
All the sacrifice, the whole sacrifice is like, remember, and it's all the blessing.
Yeah, yes.
So I believe either we're wrong in the way of stating that because we cut the lines when we do that technology.
Yeah.
Or maybe
Sorry?
sorry, I'll just think about that a bit more.
Brother William?
Yeah, so maybe this one can at least bring clarity in my mind. For instance, if we go to Middle history, we teach that 1863 is the second coming. When we say 1863 is the second coming, we mean it is some type 1863 is pointing to the second coming, or 1863 and the second coming. 1863 is going to repeat in the second coming. What exactly do we mean?
My understanding is, when I've introduced that idea, is if the Millerite line had come to its completion, 1863 would have been the second advent. Now that didn't happen, 1863 was not, there wasn't something happening in 1863 that was a type of the second advent. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying if you had drawn out the line of the Millerites, I've developed a logic, whether people agree with it or not, the 63 would have been the second advent. That's how I've understood that.
So I think then the way we use typology is different from the real meaning of it. I don't think in the movement when we say 1844 is a type of the close of probation, we mean it for shadows. I think how we use it is that we mean that 1844 is a close of probation, as in it has the same characteristics. That's why I'm saying it, we use it in the meaning. We don't use it to mean for shadow. When I understand it well.
Okay, maybe you can
No one can hear you.
I'm saying Dempsey uses that word typology, and he says that when you use typology, it is that prophecy is not perfectly fulfilled, but it is symbolizes something that will be perfectly fulfilled. That is FSDA 19.2.
So, can you read that?
It says, in prophetic interpretation, Miller also used the principle of typology, employing it to bring out the fuller import of a text. He rationalized such methodology through the following reasoning. Prophecy is sometimes typical, that is, partially fulfilled in one event, but completely only in the last. Such was the prophecy concerning Isaac, partially fulfilled in him, wholly so in Christ. Likewise, the prophecies concerning the Jewish captivity in Babylon and their return are only partially accomplished in the history of those events. The description of these things in the prophecies are Likewise, the prophecies concerning the Jewish captivity in Babylon and their return are only partially accomplished in the history of those events. The description of these things in the prophets are so august and magnificent that if only applicable to the Jews' return, the exposition will be weak, inefficient, and barren. Therefore, I humbly believe that the exact fulfillment can only be looked for in the captivity of the church, destruction of mystical Babylon, and final glorification of the saints in the New Jerusalem state.
What does that mean? You disagree, or you say no?
I don't even understand what that is saying. Maybe you can represent it online, but how I got it is like...
That was Miller. He was quoted Miller.
He was quoting me. How I got the concept is like, what he's saying is that, let's say we take the captivity of Israel, the 70, is not a perfect fulfillment of prophecy. Did I get that right?
In itself, kind of. I think it doesn't say perfect. It's saying some prophecies are partially fulfilled, and then we have a complete fulfillment of those prophecies. I think I have examples of those from the Old Testament. You find like it's describing like in Isaiah 41, you are my battle axe, I will use it to stretch the nations. After they come from captivity, we don't see how that is fulfilled. How does the Lord use the Jews to stretch the nations?
Any other comments, Brother Cephas?
I think, based on what Brother was saying, Miller is defining the following, and he's saying that there is an impartial fulfillment and a partial fulfillment. Then we need to understand what exactly, what does it mean by partial and impartial fulfillment and partial fulfillment. And I believe it will have a correct understanding of the environment. And I'm going back to the sacrificial systems. And I'm saying that the offerings were impartial. I don't know if I'm correct on that, but then the sacrifice of Christ was closest to. Now, when it comes to the use of the Millerites and the use of the controversy, it's trying to tell us that the second Angel's message had an impartial fulfillment. The Millerites and the perfect fulfillment of that message, the second Angel's message is yet future. But when we are, according to how I understand it, he's not saying that second message, the context of the word is not solutions. So we need to delve deeper into our understanding of what the partial and impartial, for example, the focus uses that word. Then we can be able to define what typology is. Because according to me, when you're going to have typology, then we have I mean partial fulfillment, and there is a partial fulfillment.
Brother Paul?
So when I really understand that word of Mila, so Mila has read the two things. Isaac referring to Christ, that the way to understand the promise when we are given to Abraham about seed, and in Isaac to be a seed. But say that seed is going to be Christ to be a real seed. And then you compare 70 with 60. And when I take my mind back to the tithe or any type lamb, you see that mystery of typology or tithe, you see that there's a progressive work as brother Keba was saying before. That you see that the lamb and then the whole place, and then the Day of Atonement. So when it comes to the line of Christ, the antitype, we see that all that go progressively, begin from cross until the time that we are living in. So I really need a help on that, because like seed and seed, these are Isaac a type and Christ the antitype, or what did Miller want us to understand? Isaac and Christ.
We've run out of time. I don't want to pick this subject up again in the next class. What I want to do is come to some kind of conclusion that we're all able to go ahead and teach this. Let's agree on some things. We have a singular line. This line we're calling a line of events that go in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is progression or sequential. Things are happening sequentially. When you have things going sequentially, number 1 is not number 3. Number 2 is not number 4. They're independent, separate events. And so therefore, if we're going to use this concept of the word typology, which means whatever's going on at one point in history is typifying, or is an example, or is a type of something else that happens afterwards, you can't do that at that scale. So 9/11 in this line cannot be a type of this event here, which is Raphia. It doesn't point to it. You can get this line and you can cut it into certain portions as separate and distinct histories. When you do that, you can see that this history can point you to a history in the future. I've used the word point. Paul says these things were written for our ensamples, upon whom the ends of the world have come. And so the history that he's referring to back here is going to teach you something about your own history. Whatever word we want to call that, this history teaches us about this. And the way it teaches us is by seeing characteristics of what happened here, and then you can see that they're actually being fulfilled, or they're happening again here. When we look at that, we see that these individual unique histories have repeating patterns or identical characteristics to this large history, which is where we started. So we've got a line of progression, we've got individual histories in that, and each of those individual histories have the same pattern as they had at this larger scale, which is what we call fractals. So this 1, 2, 3, 4 has all the same characteristics as 1, 2, 3, 4, but this 1, 2, 3, 4 is pointing us to this 1, 2, 3, 4, and this 1, 2, 3, 4 has all the same characteristics as this history as well. So that's how we're using progression. We've used the word typology and fractals in that way. Whether or not we're using the word typology in its strictest definition, or whether we could go to a dictionary and it gives 4 definitions and one of them sounds very similar to ensamples, or another word that we might use, I'm hoping that we're all saying or seeing that we can line up AD 34 with the Sunday law. If you want to call that a type, or you don't want to call that a type, we agree that that's how you're supposed to line that up. And that you can never get 9/11, cut this line and make it line up with Raphia. Unless someone could show me how you do that, and who are the generation that you're referring to. I don't believe you can go ahead and cut this line to do that. So whether or not we can all come to the same place to say that the example of the Lamb and Christ doesn't have, or does have, all the same characteristics as AD 34 and the Sunday law, we agree how we would be using those things. That we would say the Lamb equals Christ, the AD 34 equals the Sunday law. I think we're all using that in the right way. Perhaps we're not using the right word to do that. Maybe it's a limitation of our understanding of the English language, or maybe the English language is broader than we are giving it credence, and one person can say it's typology because they can go into the word typology or type, and they can see one of the definitions of type, according to Webster's, is stamp, and we saw one of the definitions of ensample is stamp, and ensample may be not exactly the same word as type, but it has this overlap when you go to synonyms. So I don't know if we're becoming too critical of how we're using these words, and I guess I'm probably not finding it overly helpful that I can't see we're coming to a conclusion by saying whether it's a type or not, because we don't even have a proper substitute word unless we're going to start using the word ensample. So I don't know if sample is direct equivalent to type. It's a synonym, but synonyms are not direct equivalents. They have similar characteristics, but they may not be exactly the same word. So maybe we're treading on people's consciences when we're trying to force people to say, you're not allowed to use the word type, you have to use another word. And if the other word is ensample, then we'd have to show that a lamb is not an ensample of Christ. I guess you'd have to prove that to define that it's not the same thing. I'm not sure if we have the ability to do that because the English language isn't so definitive. So at least we've got to the place where we can hopefully all agree what a progression is, what we'll call a type is, and what a fractal is, and how we're supposed to use them. As soon as you get fractals, the use of fractals has very similar characteristics to what we would normally call typology or these ensamples. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we ask and pray for a blessing upon this study. Help each of us, Lord, not to be trammeled by other people's thoughts and ideas, but rather may we all come into unity of understanding, and not only understanding but of usage of these words, so that when we go out teaching these truths, that people would hear and see a common thread, a common understanding, a common way of explaining these thoughts and ideas, that we would not be contradicting one another. We ask for a special blessing upon the food that we're to eat, and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.